Well, I'd like to welcome you all today to your graduate level history class focused on World War II. Today we're going to talk about and discuss the atomic bombing of Japan. You know, it's very interesting because that topic is a hot topic of discussion 77 years after it occurred. It's still being debated today. There are people who say that it was absolutely, positively necessary, and there are people equally passionate who have said that it was a total disaster, a waste of time, and had no effect on the end of World War II. Today you were handed two pieces of paper as you walked in the classroom. We're going to take a little poll before we begin our discussion. If you've heard of the bombings and you've thought about it in the past or discussed it or been taught about it in a previous classroom, and you think that the bombing was totally justified and played a major part of the end of World War II in the Pacific, please mark a plus on your piece of paper, just a small plus sign. If you have the opposite opinion and you think that World War II ended because of other means or other reasons, or if you think there could have been equally effective alternatives to the use of the atomic bomb, please mark a minus on your paper. If you absolutely don't know or have no opinion or aren't sure, put a 0. And if you've never heard of this before, just leave it blank. And we're gonna take another poll a little bit later. I'll give you about 10 seconds, mark your papers. Please pass them to the front of the room. Okay. In May of 1945, Germany surrendered in Europe. It was surrounded on both sides by huge armies, with the Soviet army numbering approximately 16 million men under arms and women. The West was somewhat smaller and less intense, but nonetheless provided the pincer movement that resulted in the surrender of Nazi Germany. That left Japan fighting the United States, Britain, and several other countries, Australia, on their own. They were already well into losing much of the territory that they gained in the later 1930s and the very early 1940s, prior to Pearl Harbor. Japan, at that point in time, knew at some level that it was going to lose the war. The only question is when. They were losing ground. They effectively lost their entire Navy and their entire Air Force. They were defenseless in the water and in the air. The United States was bombing Japan at will, with virtually, at that point in time, no losses in aircraft. The B-29 could fly higher and faster than any Japanese plane in the sky, including their fighters, and it could fly higher than the range of their anti-aircraft guns. So it was virtually immune to interception at high altitude. At that point in time, several things happened. One, the Allies, the victorious Allies in Europe, held several conferences during the war and one major conference after the war known as the Potsdam Conference. That was held in late July, early August of 1945. And by that time, Roosevelt had died, Truman was president in the U.S., of course, Joseph Stalin was the unopposed, unequivocal, and unrivaled master of the Soviet Union. And during the conference, Winston Churchill lost an election and was replaced by Clement Attlee, who finished the conference. At that conference, several things occurred that were very relevant to Japan, even though the conference was primarily focused on Germany. As a result of the conference, there was a declaration issued known as the Potsdam Declaration. That declaration implored and required Japan to surrender unconditionally, immediately, or suffer dire consequences. What Japan didn't know, of course, is the U.S. during the conference had successfully tested the world's first atomic bomb at Alamogordo, New Mexico. During the conference, Truman told Stalin about the bomb, who simply smiled and said, okay. And the reason he simply smiled and said okay is he actually knew about the success of Alamogordo through his spy network before Truman actually heard about it. So Stalin was fully aware of the implications of the atomic bomb. In a previous conference, Stalin also agreed to, once Germany was defeated, to move his forces into Asia and attack Japan from the land side of the Sino-Soviet border, which he reiterated that he was prepared to do, but hadn't done so yet. In any event, using the premise that the atomic bomb would provide the means for Japan to surrender honorably, because that was Bushido was a big part of Japanese culture. Truman, who said, quote, "I lose no sleep over this decision," authorized the use of the bombs. The first one, as everyone or most know, was against Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, caused about 70 or so to 100,000 deaths, mostly civilian. And then the second bomb, of course, was August 9th in Nagasaki, which only caused 45 or 50,000 deaths because it was slightly off target. On August 8th, the Soviet Union attacked en masse the Japanese army that was occupying Manchuria. Japan had about 750 battle-hardened soldiers defending Manchuria. The Soviets attacked with well over 1 million and overran the Japanese army, decimated it in 4 days. So now Japan is facing an atomic bomb, which it really wasn't dealing with very well because it didn't believe that it was actually happening. And it was facing a Soviet invasion from the north and a communist potential takeover of some of their islands. Well, needless to say, Japan surrendered August 15th after an immense battle, including a small revolution among among junior army officers that occurred just before the emperor's announcement of surrender on the 15th. The question is, what really changed Japan's mind? What did they do? Well, what was going on is Japan, not knowing that the Soviet Union had an agreement to attack, was trying to use the Soviet Union to broker a peace on slightly more favorable terms than unconditional surrender with the United States. During that time, Japan had an ambassador in Moscow. He was working to bring this negotiation about, and Moscow was simply stalling them off. They didn't say no, of course they didn't say yes, and then all of a sudden Japan was essentially shattered when the Soviet Union attacked them. Now they're in a box. They have nowhere to go. The U.S. is planning, without the atomic bomb, the U.S. was planning for an invasion. At the time, Japan still had 6 million military personnel, mostly in the Army, because the Air Force and the Navy were pretty much gone. That would end, and as the Allies, or the U.S., island hopped closer and closer to Japan, they became more and more fanatic about their defense. An example of this is, it's really tragic, but when the United States attacked Iwo Jima in early 1945, there were 21,000 Japanese defenders on the island. 21,000. The United States attacked with 70,000 Marines and, of course, lost quite a few. Japan, on the other hand, out of 21,000 troops, slightly over 200 ended up as prisoners. They were captured, they surrendered and were captured. 20,800 or so died. And they died without surrender because of their culture and the way Japan worked and looked at surrender as betrayal. So the United States knew that, and Okinawa was essentially very similar. Although there were more prisoners taken, the vast majority of the defenders of Okinawa, which took 3 months, by the way, to capture, died in the process. Japanese civilians were being armed with swords and spears to fight in the streets, and millions of them had volunteered, besides the 6 million military personnel. So that's what the U.S. was faced with. There were other options that people pointed out. We could have warned Japan that the bomb is coming and given them the opportunity to evacuate a city and then blow it up. We could have blown up, demonstrated the bomb in Tokyo Bay, which would, of course, decimated the bay and probably wrecked miles and miles and miles of shoreline. We could have done several other things, all of which were options, all of which were considered, and all of which were rejected. Options for the bomb were very interesting. Of course, the primary one was to avoid an invasion that could cost possibly 1 million American casualties or more. The second one of which, it was, and this is the one that's the sticking point, was we were really sending a message to the Soviet Union that A, we were more powerful than they were, and B, we were willing to use that power. That's an interesting theory, and that's probably the one that is most used to justify secondarily the use of the bomb. But you have to decide on your own whether that makes it justified. At the time, 5 of the 6 American generals and admirals that had 5 stars, 5 of the 6 were against the use of the bomb, including Dwight Eisenhower and General MacArthur in the Pacific. Of course, that motive might be questionable. He probably wanted to see an invasion because he was a land general, but that's another story. In any event, the bomb was used. One other justification, which is I find very interesting, is one, we spent $2 billion developing it. What did we do that for if we don't use it? That one's an interesting one. Many religious leaders were appalled and very, very upset by its use and thought it was immoral and unconscionable to apply this weapon to civilians and to become the first nation on earth to do so. Anyway, I think it's time that you now look at those factors and others and make your own decision whether you feel, at this point, whether the use of that bomb was justified, or secondarily, did it actually produce the result which ended the war in the Pacific? It's your call. So take your second piece of paper and fill it out similar to the first. Again, if you are for and you thought it was justifiable and usable and brought the war to a close, was a major factor in that process, please mark an X, a plus, sorry, plus. Well, plus is an X on its side. If you don't think it was justified and or did not play the major role in the ending of the war, a minus. If you're still undecided because the pros and cons kind of balance out, a 0. And I don't think anybody at this point can return a blank because you've now all heard about this issue. And you're all part of the discussion that continues to this very day. In any event, I want to thank you all for your participation, for being in this class, and most of all, for your open minds. Thank you, and we'll see you again at the next class.